All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a wonderfully absurd, highly cinematic piece of 19th century economics that's cleverly disguised as a fable. We're looking at Leo Tolstoy's brilliant short story, Two Deer. I want you to just imagine the soaring strings of an orchestral score swelling in the background, right? Because we are about to explore this fascinating intersection of justice, bureaucracy, and just simple math, all set against the backdrop of one of the most glamorous locations in the world. It's an emotional, yet really lighthearted story. It's got all the warmth, the cobblestone charm, and the grand palaces you'd expect from a historic tale, but it comes with a twist that feels incredibly relevant to how we manage our very own systems today.
So picture this for a second. You have a fully functioning government. We're talking laws, a king, royal ministers, the whole shebang. And then someone breaks the law. The legal system works exactly as it's supposed to, right? A trial happens, a sentence is handed down. But then you hit a massive roadblock. What happens when the sheer cost of actually upholding that law threatens to completely bankrupt the entire nation? It's this wild paradox. The law demands punishment, but the royal checkbook says, yeah, absolutely not. To really wrap our heads around this, we need to set the scene. On one hand, you have the gorgeous, lush 19th century Kingdom of Monaco. We're talking about a peaceful Mediterranean paradise, bathed in this beautiful, warm lighting. Picture grand palaces, incredibly realistic historical architecture, and pristine, sweeping gardens. I mean, it looks rich, it feels rich. But behind those grand palace doors, we see a pretty hilarious hidden reality, the actual size of the royal treasury. Because despite its grandiose appearance, Monaco in this era was a tiny, tiny kingdom with a miniature budget to match. They collected modest taxes on things like tobacco and spirits, but the revenue? Incredibly slim. It was basically a kingdom that survived on pinching pennies while looking like $1,000,000. And this brilliantly illustrates the tension of our story, which brings us to the inciting incident. For years, Monaco was a notoriously peaceful place. No major drama, no real need for a heavy-handed police force. But then, a poor man commits a minor crime within the kingdom's borders, and suddenly, this dormant, historically peaceful legal system is forced to spring into action. The judges don their robes, the lawyers make their impassioned cases, and the rusty gears of justice start turning for the very first time in recent memory. Well, the trial goes exactly as you would expect in any standard legal system. The man is found guilty, and the initial verdict is handed down: imprisonment. Case closed, right? I mean, the system worked. But here is where the story pivots from a standard legal drama into an absolute bureaucratic nightmare. Because, as it turns out, handing down a sentence is one thing. Actually carrying it out is quite another, especially when you're a miniature kingdom that has never actually had to maintain a long-term penal system. They don't even have a proper prison.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer disparity we're dealing with. If you compare the kingdom's entire available discretionary budget, which is just a tiny little sliver, to the projected annual cost of carrying out this man's sentence, it's mind-boggling. You have to feed the prisoner, obviously, but you also have to hire a guard to watch him around the clock, and you have to maintain a dedicated building just to hold him. When the ministers actually sit down and do the math, they realize the cost of guarding, housing, and feeding a single prisoner wildly eclipses what their tiny state treasury can actually afford. Upholding the law is literally going to plunge the government into immediate, crushing debt.
So naturally, panic sets in at the Grand Palace. The king and his ministers hold a series of highly expressive, honestly rather humorous royal meetings. They are desperately brainstorming alternatives, which leads to this completely absurd escalation plan. Step 1 was imprisonment, which we now know is way too expensive, so they move to step 2, execution. It sounds barbaric, sure, but to the number-crunching ministers, hey, it's a quick, one-time expense. But there's a catch. Monaco doesn't have a guillotine, and they certainly don't have an executioner on standby, which leads them to step 3. They literally have to import an executioner and the necessary machinery from a neighboring country, like France or Italy.
So the ministers send out diplomatic letters to get some quotes, and when the replies come back, they run the numbers again. And the cost breakdown is staggering. Lifetime imprisonment upkeep was already bankrupting them, right? But the fees for hiring a foreign executioner, transporting the machine, and building the arrangements are somehow even more expensive. Even the absolute cheapest quote they get from a neighboring military would require the king to levy a heavy new tax on his citizens just to afford the execution, a tax that would almost certainly cause a violent riot in those beautiful cobblestone streets. They are completely trapped. Keeping the guy alive is too expensive, but killing him is completely out of their budget. Which brings us to the climax, and honestly, the most brilliant part of Tolstoy's narrative. The king and his ministers are sitting around, just utterly defeated by the economics of their own legal system. They realize they simply cannot afford to punish this man. So the king issues a completely unprecedented, utterly absurd royal order. He decides to simply release the prisoner. But wait, it gets better. To ensure the man actually leaves and doesn't cause any more trouble, the king grants him a state pension. Yes, you heard that right. They decide to pay the criminal.
The crucial detail here is this very specific, very small number, a modest pension of 600 francs. The ministers calculate that paying the criminal this yearly stipend to voluntarily walk away and never come back is miraculously the cheapest legal option available to the entire government. It's a fraction of the cost of a prison guard, and it requires zero construction. By abandoning the strict, rigid rules of justice and just looking practically at the balance sheet, paying the bad guy becomes the ultimate fiscal victory.
Let's just trace how this wildly unpredictable journey worked out for our protagonist. We go from committing a minor crime to facing life imprisonment to suddenly being released with a guaranteed government income. And the ending is remarkably satisfying and lighthearted. The man takes his very first pension payment, cheerfully walks just across the border, completely out of Monaco's jurisdiction, buys a little bit of land, and happily settles down to live a peaceful life. He becomes a highly respectable neighbor, crossing the border only to collect his royal pension on time every single year.
It's a hilarious, emotional, yet beautifully simple ending that delivers a profoundly deep message. The core takeaway from this explainer and from Tolstoy's cinematic little tale is right here. Practical wisdom is often more valuable than blind obedience to rules. The King of Monaco could have stubbornly insisted on upholding the strict letter of the law, bankrupted his country, and caused a massive revolt. Instead, he swallowed his pride, looked at the practical reality of the situation, and chose the solution that actually worked, even if it seemed entirely backward at first glance. Common sense triumphed over bureaucratic rigidity.
And, that leaves us with something really important to think about today. We might not be living in a lush 19th century kingdom, but we are absolutely surrounded by massive systems, strict policies, and unending bureaucracy. So I want you to look at your own industry, your own community, or even just your own daily habits and ask yourself, where in our modern world are rigid rules costing us more than common sense? Where are we paying for a metaphorical prison guard when a simple, practical compromise would solve the problem for a fraction of the cost? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the rules.